All right. Well, it is 2 o'clock Mountain Time, and so I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this University of Colorado Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual session. It's taking place today, Wednesday, April 18th, 2020. I also want to wish everyone a happy Passover for those of you who are celebrating that beginning this evening. My name is Max Boykoff. I'll be your moderator today. I'm an associate professor in the environmental studies program here at CU Boulder. I'm also director of the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research, which is part of the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. This session today is called Listen to the Scientists. I could put different inflection in there, but I'll just say listen to the scientists. So we have 4 wonderful speakers to help us explore the contours of this very fundamental remit. So shortly, I'll introduce those speakers. Each will offer opening remarks about 7 or 8 minutes. Then there'll be a discussion amongst the panelists and myself before we then turn to audience questions. And so time will run out in about 90 minutes. This is a 90-minute session. Regarding those questions, you may submit them through the Zoom function at any time during the session. And so when you do that, I request that you include your location so that we can see where you're sending your question from. And also note whether you are a student, because one of the great Conference on World Affairs traditions has been to give good student questions priority and to hear from student voices. So first, we're going to hear from Beth Bartel. I'm going to provide a short introduction for each of them in turn. So we'll hear from Beth first. Beth is a science communications specialist for UNAVCO, which is a consortium and nonprofit that measures our changing planet. With a background in geoscience and journalism, she specializes in natural hazards and trains geoscientists in science communication so that they can better be heard. So wonderful interdisciplinarian within our midst, and happy to turn the virtual stage over to you, Beth.
Great, thanks, Max. And I love that you started by commenting on inflection of that sentence, because when I read this topic, I thought, right, listen to the scientist. Oh, listen to the scientist. And I thought of so many of us in our minds doing this and making it into a question, oh, why don't people just listen to the scientists? And I like to challenge people anytime we have one of those questions, one of those like hands in the air, frustrated questions, to take that question and tone down the tone, level out the tone, and ask it with genuine curiosity. So I think what we need to do is ask the question, why don't people listen to the scientists? And then the answers can help us be better communicators. So from my perspective as both a scientist and someone who trains and tries to help scientists be better communicators, that's my main goal, is how can we as scientists be more listenable? And social science gives us some really good input on this, some tips. So I'm gonna share a few tips and a few reasons why people don't just listen to scientists all the time. And one is that as scientists, a lot of times we operate from what's called the deficit model, which some folks listening might be familiar with. It's the fancy term for the idea that we can just throw information at people or give people information and they'll make the right decisions. So it's all about the information. And as it turns out, social science has found that that's not how we form opinions and how we make our choices and how we take action. A lot of it is up here, and an awful lot of it, actually more of it, even for us as scientists, because we're human too, our opinions and decisions and actions really come from our feelings, our emotions, our values, our interests. So we need to think about, when we're thinking about communicating science, well, how can I connect with those values? So if we really want to be heard, we need to be able to connect with people's values and such. So for example, with particularly charged topics that we're familiar with, like climate change, evolution, there are studies that show that our opinions about these topics are not based on the information alone, but we can correlate them to some extent with our political party in the case of climate change, or a religion in the case of evolution. So there are these really strong identity factors that that inform what we decide. And so as scientists, just presenting the information and saying, hey, change your whole frame of how you see the world, like that's a really big ask for people. So we really need to be thinking about how we're presenting information. The second thing that I think as scientists we need to remember is that science isn't the only factor in a decision, and nor should it be. So as a geoscientist, for example, I think about New Orleans, and New Orleans is a city that is built below the level of the river that flows through it. So, how is that a great idea? So after Katrina, what do we do? Like, why wouldn't we rebuild it somewhere else? And so that's another great question. Why wouldn't we rebuild it somewhere else? Well, because there are social factors involved, because there are economic factors involved, because there are mental health factors involved. The same with our current pandemic. We need to make decisions based on the biological science, and we also need to look at these other factors as well when making decisions. So as scientists, we need to remember that science isn't the only thing, and really work to inform decisions, because certainly science absolutely should be part of decision-making processes. Another factor is that people don't have to listen to science. So a lot of times as scientists, we may be more used to presenting our science through papers that other scientists have to read, because if they're in the same field, they have to know what research is done in that field. Well, the public and policymakers don't have to read those papers. And if we present science in a really dry way that doesn't relate to people, then we have no audience. So we also need to work on really understanding our audience needs and interests, and what's going to be relevant to people, and figure out what science is really most important to present. And then the last thing that I wanted to share that I think is maybe the juiciest and most fun part of the topic is there are a lot of voices out there to compete with. So when we're asking people to listen to scientists, a lot of times we're asking them to listen to scientists and don't listen to these other voices that might be really tempting. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of pseudoscience. There are conspiracy theorists that seem like they're doing a public good by sharing the real information, and really they're able to monetize that. So they're able to make money off people following their YouTube channels or purchasing materials from their online stores. And a real challenge we have as scientists is we don't have access to the same tools that people who aren't in the official scientific realm have. We can't sensationalize. We can't undermine authorities. We are the authorities. So things that are really compelling about things like conspiracy theories, undermining authority, being privy to special hidden information, sensationalism, which also applies to a lot of world press. We don't have these tools, so we have to find other ways to reach people. And one example of that is, for example, with Yellowstone, a lot of people are constantly looking to headlines suggesting that Yellowstone might be more active or leading to eruption, and it's not. These are consistently sensationalized headlines, misinterpreted data. And so one thing, for example, that the USGS scientist in charge of Yellowstone Volcano Observatory has done is try to fill that information void. So putting out good information. And of course, he can't sensationalize because he's trying to present the truth. But we can at least try to fill those information voids with good information. And we need to give people the opportunity to listen to us and make that information accessible if we want to be heard. And I'll end on that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Beth. And now we're going to turn to Elliot Pepper. Elliot Pepper is a best-selling science fiction writer and the author of 9 novels that explore the intersection of technology and culture. He's created award-winning websites, designed critically acclaimed games, and sends a popular reading recommendation newsletter around as well. So thanks very much for joining us, Elliot, and the virtual space is yours now.
Thanks for having me. So first of all, I'm not a scientist, and I make things up for a living. So I think that, you know, number one on the agenda should be that, according to the title of this panel, you probably shouldn't listen to me. You know, when CWA reached out and asked me to participate, I started thinking about what the relationship of science fiction is to science itself. And it reminded me of a story from Kenneth Lacavora, who is a well-known paleontologist who actually discovered, which I think still is, the largest known dinosaur. He's a member of the Explorers Club and very well regarded. And Ken says that for all the scientific papers he's published, he thinks that Jurassic Park, the book and the Mike Crichton book and the movie, has actually had a bigger influence on the field of paleontology. And the reason is that so many of his graduate students, so many of the researchers he works with, were inspired to go into paleontology because they read that book or watched that movie when they were kids. And that it has really created a tremendous growth in his field, even though you know, paleontologists can obviously get together and joke about all the things that the movie gets wrong. And I think that there's a very interesting relationship there between the stories we tell about science and science itself. And in fact, that goes back a long time. Johannes Kepler, who, you know, first described the laws of planetary motion and is a major figure in the scientific revolution, also wrote what is probably the first, what we would call a modern science fiction book in the 17th century. It's called The Dream, and it follows a group of humans that managed to visit the moon. And, you know, it describes gravity before Newton actually came up with his laws. It describes synthesized speech centuries before you know, we actually had Alexa. And it also, you know, describes space travel hundreds of years before that ever was something that we were able to realize technologically. And I think that the reason that Kepler wrote The Dream as he did is instructive. One of the reasons why he wanted to use fiction was precisely because there were so many voices in his world that ran counter to science. You know, if he talked too stridently or too directly to his own research, that was risking his life. And in fact, his mother was prosecuted as a witch, in part because he published this science fiction story. So, you know, the relationship between science and science fiction has been going on since the scientific revolution, and it's one that keeps evolving. You know, there's sort of the flip side of the fact that some scientists might be inspired to work on new problems because of the imagined futures they read about, is also that science fiction writers like myself are inspired all the time by what scientists are working on, by what technologists are building. And so it's a feedback loop that goes back and forth. And as Beth mentioned, scientists have a really special role to play in society, and that is part of why many lay people don't read scientific journals, because the journals don't sensationalize. They are very specific. They're trying to describe reality in a peer reviewable way. And as a storyteller, I almost look at it in the reverse. You know, Seth Godin has a great sort of metaphor for this, where he says that if you imagine an idea as the as the pit in the middle of a cherry that, you know, nobody really wants a cherry pit, right? You can't hand someone a pile of cherry pits; they're not going to be interested. But if it has a cherry around it, if you if you hand someone a pile of cherries, they'll be delighted and it'll be delicious. And so part of the role of a story is to actually wrap that meat around the pit, right? Like we're trying to take pits and turn them into cherries that people actually want to eat. And I think that's in many ways what science fiction can offer. It takes science and it makes it easier to listen to by bringing story to the fore. Neil Gaiman says that, you know, a good story is something that makes you want to find out what happens next, and where the ending doesn't leave you dissatisfied. And so I think that's you know, a really interesting way to look at the situation. We have all of this incredible research that's happening in the world and happening in the academy that often doesn't move very far beyond the borders of the academy, that many people who aren't working as experts in the field don't get access to the insights that those experts are discovering. And I think that's where stories play, in that intersection. If you really zoom out, you know, science fiction is almost a way of culturally processing the new discoveries that innovators are actually making. It's a way to try to take the facts of what we're learning about reality, about the universe, and translate them into meaning. And that's a process, that's a cultural process that takes time. And often it takes a longer time than the research itself. You know, we've had so much scientific advances in the past couple hundred years that I think it's taking time for our culture to keep up. And I think that in many ways, that's sort of the project of science fiction. And to the extent that it works, I think it's a tool for helping people listen to the scientists, as I certainly love to do. So I think that's a good note to end on.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And for those of us, for those joining us a little bit late, I've just been asked to remind everyone that this is a session called Listen to the Scientists, or Listen to the Scientists, as Beth puts it. And it is the Conference on World Affairs virtual session for today, Wednesday, April 8th. And so now we're going to turn to Seth Shostak. He's a senior astronomer and Institute Fellow at the SETI Institute with a long history of research in radio astronomy and in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. He's written 4 books and more than 600 popular articles on science and technology, and hosts the weekly radio show Big Picture Science. So maybe he is another wonderful storyteller that we can turn to, thinking about the cherry on the pit. And the floor is now yours. Seth,
Thank you very much, Max. I appreciate the fact that Elliot pointed out that science is actually the pits. Well, okay, good. Look, I think part of the reason that we don't listen to the scientists as much as at least the scientists would like is that we're maybe not wired to do that. You know, you think about it, when did science begin? I mean, in the modern sense, you could go back 2,200 years to this guy, Eratosthenes, who was sitting there in Alexandria and figured out a way, an experiment to measure the diameter of the earth, which he did. Okay, he got it right, actually, I think better than 10%. I don't remember reading his paper, but whatever. You know, and you could say, well, that was fantastic and would have been very useful to Christopher Columbus, you know, 1,600 years later, 1,700. But, you know, Chris actually did know that the earth was of a certain size, and yet he still managed to, you know, misjudge where he had landed. Well, that's all history. You don't care about that. But the point is that science is a pretty new thing. Homo sapiens has been strutting, you know, this mortal coil for 300,000 years, and only in the last 2,000 have we done anything that you would call science. So no wonder people aren't wired to listen to the scientists. They're wired to listen to that guy over there, that big guy. You know, maybe he's the sports hero today, but some big guy who has a better chance of bringing some edible protein to the ground and bringing it back to everybody else, right? He's the guy you have to listen to. Scientists. There's another difference today. In the 19th century, there was a lot of science being done. It was mostly what they call gentleman's science, where people of means, people who had money and not much else to do, could sort of piddle around in the garden, look at the worms. Guys like Chucky Darwin, for example. They were people who kind of funded themselves. They were interested in things. There wasn't a whole lot of science that was known, so they could make major discoveries without having to have a $50,000 lab or a $5 billion accelerator in southern France. They could do all this pretty easily. But the problem is, while everybody could understand measuring the diameter of the Earth, I mean, everybody could relate to that, ask your neighbors, hey, Bob, how important do you think it was to have discovered the Higgs boson? How did that affect your daily life? I mean, you're selling shoes down at the mall. Is that important to you? And do you understand what it means? And, what if they hadn't found it? And, was it worth all that money? They have no idea, I think. I think it's fair to say they have no idea. So in a sense, to say, listen to the scientists, you have to make it relevant. And that's harder to do because science has become harder. It's simply much more complicated. It's more sophisticated. If you look at any science journal, the scientists themselves, with the exception of a half dozen people who are competing with you for tenure at some fourth-rate university, except for those people, nobody can understand that thing. So it is difficult. Let me just move on a little bit to pseudoscience, because that is something that has been brought up. I think Max brought it up. It's something that does have a large audience. Now, when you say pseudoscience, pardon my bias here, but in my line of work, UFOs are, a topic of endless interest. Ancient aliens who had employed aliens to build big pointy buildings in Egypt and stuff like that. And I get phone calls every day from people who want to report UFOs and stuff like that, but also angels, who killed JFK, remote viewing. That's great, remote viewing. I wish I could find a remote viewer who actually could remote view, because I would take them to Las Vegas, have them see what the dealer's doing, or Bigfoot, all that sort of thing. Now, most of that, it's frustrating because it's totally anti-science, but on the other hand, it's kind of entertaining, and that's why it appeals to a lot of people. And also it gives them an explanation for things that doesn't rely on, all those people with the academic credentials, like the people you're listening to right now, right? who have a sheepskin on the wall and, a tweed jacket somewhere with letter reinforcements in the elbows. So it's a better story. And I think that, of course, and it's already been mentioned here, but I think that that's really probably the most effective thing we can do for getting science out there. Scientists in general are regarded very highly by the public, higher than politicians, or for that matter, even reporters. So it's not that people have a disregard for science, but they don't listen to it too much. A survey some years ago showed that the majority of people got most of their science learning from Star Trek. Well, all right. If that's the case, maybe we ought to put more science into Star Trek. We could talk about that later. But I find that when you talk about science, either you're preaching to the choir, you're preaching to people who are already interested in science, or you're not preaching to anyone. So I do think that we have to do what Shakespeare would have tried to do. Make sure we portray science as something they can understand, something that is relevant, and don't make yourself a cipher, as Shakespeare would worry about, just a model of that pointy-headed guy down at the local university.
Thank you very much, Seth. Some good provocative introductory remarks. Really appreciate that. Now we get to hear from Tashiro. Ty is a social scientist and author of 2 books. One is called The Science of Happily Ever After, and the other is called Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome. So thank you very much for joining us, Ty, and the floor is yours now.
Hey, I thought I'd start with a quick anecdote. I'd been up to upstate New York to speak at a conference last year. And when I was checking in, the people who invited me had put PhD behind my name. It's a little embarrassing, but the woman checking me in said, hey, we had a bunch of PhDs here last week for a big conference. I think it was a physics conference. And then she kind of got this look of dismay on her face. She said, almost all of them could not find their cabin. They could not navigate their way. Well, most people usually can. And they got lost in the woods, and she had to kind of hold everyone's hand and take them to their lodging. And she looked at me then and kind of paused as if to be like, "Are you going to get lost too in the woods?" And I thought, yeah, I probably will. Fortunately, I didn't that time, but scientists are not good at a lot of things. They're not good at common sense things sometimes. Probably not the person you want planning your big party or advising you on fashion or all kinds of different things. Stereotypically, there's places we don't have strengths. But there are some things that scientists are very good at and kind of uniquely situated to provide knowledge that could be unique and, of course, very helpful. One of the things that scientists do is they're good at measuring things that are invisible. And I don't know if that was the plan from the start, but it's kind of turned out over the years that's been one of the real strengths of the scientific approach. When I was in 5th grade and they were trying to teach me about atoms and telling me that my desk was made up of all these tiny particles, I just thought that sounded like the most ridiculous thing ever. How could that possibly be the case? One of the things that I've been interested in is the scientific study of romantic love. And there's invisible things with that as well. Now, if someone is smitten over somebody else, that's pretty obvious. You don't need to be a psychologist or a researcher to pick that out a lot of times. But let's say somebody has a growing fancy for someone and they're pretty good at hiding it. To be able to put that person in an fMRI and to ask them about this person they might have a crush on, and to see activations in regions of the brain that would tell us that, no, you really do like this person. It's not just a friend. That's fascinating on the one hand. On the other hand, it's really hard to explain. How do you explain all the technicalities of an fMRI? And why a certain region of the brain would tell us that someone has romantic interest versus just liking for someone. Now, there are really good, solid explanations for those kinds of things, but to backtrack and to explain step by step how to do that, it takes 4 or 5 years to do that. So I think that's one of the challenges that scientists run up against a lot of times. And we're seeing it right now. Of course, a virus is invisible to the naked eye. And so to say there's this thing that's lurking and it's going to cause a tremendous amount of destruction, but you just have to trust us. And in fact, if you do trust us, you'll never see the full effects of it. It's kind of understandable why people might have some initial doubt about that. And so what some of the other folks had to say about building trust and building some rapport with the general public, I think is really important. The other thing that happens with scientists is they do make mistakes, and they make a lot of mistakes. In fact, if you were to see how many failed studies someone has to go through before they find a robust effect, you'd wonder why they would be so masochistic to submit themselves to years of agony like that. But scientists seem to have a resiliency to keep trying and trying again and refining their methods and refining the hypotheses and theories until they arrive upon something that is reliable and predictive and robust. But in the meantime, they're making a lot of mistakes. And one of the things we're seeing right now, I think, is that those mistakes or those slight errors are happening in real time. They don't have the option to have those miscalculations happen in the privacy of their lab and years later come out with some result. We're all kind of following along as this thing evolves. And so one of the issues you see is that they have to hedge their bets. So when they say, hey, we think this is the trajectory for New York City, or we think this is the trajectory for the Denver metro area, they'll put error around that. They'll use language that sometimes sounds unconfident compared to other people speaking about the pandemic. And so that's one of the real challenges. Now, one of the things that scientists are good at, though, is they're good at keeping track of their mistakes. So they're good at recording the observations and the data and the analyses and sharing those failures with one another. We're getting better at that, actually, not a real strength, but so there's a lot of mistakes, but they're good at keeping track of it and then trying not to make the same mistakes again. And that's something you'll see as this continues to go forward, is that as the data sets get bigger and the measurement gets better, they'll be able to make more confident predictions and deliver more clear advice. But I think for the general public, that can be frustrating sometimes, that the messaging doesn't come across as clear and definitive. The last thing I wanted to say was that for any of us in anything, we can usually only know our little corner of the world. And so for most things in life, for me, I don't know much at all about how that operates for other people. And one of the great benefits of science, I think, sometimes gets easily overlooked, is that the collection of large data sets and the surveying of large samples or populations allows them to generalize to the general public as far as what's causing something and what might be a good intervention going forward much better than any of us can individually, just from our corner of the world. But once again, unfortunately, that takes some time. There's a lot of trial and error in figuring out what's going on. And it's really, in the end, as much frustration as there is and as much confusion as there is, I think it's remarkable what's happening right now in science. The degree of collaboration internationally, the communication mediums that exist for people to collaborate in real time, it's really unprecedented. And I think, hopefully we'll have a much better handle on what's going on here and be able to deliver some solutions and relief to people in the months to come.
Thanks very much, Ty. So you've each contributed, I think, some really wonderful initial comments here. And I've made a list here of about 6 or 7 things that I'd like to follow up on and ask each of you as a panel. But before maybe I do that, and before then we turn to audience questions, wonder if any of you had any reactions to what someone else has said on the panel, or just some of the themes that have come up. Anybody have any initial thoughts on the panel?
I was wondering, maybe for Elliot, as a storyteller and somebody who's great at activating people's imagination, are there things that you see sometimes with the kind of hardcore scientists when they're trying to communicate with the public, and you think to yourself, gosh, I wish you would do X, Y, and Z a little bit differently?
Sure, yeah, there are a few things. I mean, Seth mentioned that based on the title of this panel, we may be preaching to a choir, right? Who signs up to watch a panel that is called Listen to the Scientists? Probably people who are already listening and who are frustrated by how others don't. So, one thing that I'd say as a professional storyteller is if you as a member of this audience, if you come across, if you're a scientist and you want to share your research with a friend or family, or simply you're interested in science and you learn something that you want to share, I mean, honestly, try leading with a story. I know it sounds silly and it sounds really basic, but it really helps. Like Seth said, we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years as a species, and we've only been doing formal science for at most a couple of thousand years, and really more like a couple of hundred years. And so what do we do with the rest of our time? Well, honestly, stories are a large part of how we make sense of the world and how we explain the world to our children and to each other, right? I mean, mythology is, as an entire category, are basically stories that help to explain the world. And, many of those explanations aren't true, of course. And now that we're discovering new truths, we need new mythologies that can make those truths digestible. So I'd say that if you're at dinner tonight with your family and you learn something today, or there's something important, it's a new scientific development that you want to share, lead with a story. That story could be as simple as, if you are doing your own research, why you got into doing that research, right? It could be as simple as how the general principles that the research resulted in would impact an individual person's life. It could be the story where the world itself is the main character and you're imagining how it might change. But if you lead with a story and the truth, the scientific facts that you're trying to convey are effectively its moral, you might realize that it leads the conversation in a very different direction than if you just try to attack the facts straight on.
I think an obvious example of that is any religion, right? Every religion has its own scripture. Those are stories. That's how you convey, a worldview, information, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
You want to jump in?
I think, yeah, this is only maybe slightly related, but something that I wanted to comment on anyway. So I'm just going to pretend it's an exact segue. I think also as scientists, we have not only do we maybe forget or fit certain molds. I think really there are stereotypes about what a scientist is, and I think we can be confined personally by those stereotypes. And I think as fellow scientists, we can limit other fellow scientists with those stereotypes. So the stereotype that maybe we don't tell stories or we don't use humor, that we're not fashionable or stylish. That I think we hold each other in some ways to these stereotypes. And in that way, we aren't allowing a lot of scientists to be their full selves. And I think not only can that keep people from getting into science, because people who aren't in science, who are students, maybe are looking and saying, well, I don't fit that profile. So, science isn't for me, I guess, even if they have the skill set that goes with science. But then also we're stopping ourselves from being really relatable as communicators. And when we start to share not only the science stories, but, our personal stories as well, and our personal, more of ourselves, then I think we allow those communication connections and the building of trust by allowing a scientist to not be a person in a lab coat and show more of our human sides and the diversity within science and scientists.
I'm sorry, Beth, to jump in yet again here, but I have to say that I occasionally consult for films. And my experience is not that scientists are saying, hey, Ralph, forget the spiky hair and that weird outfit of yours. We want you to wear the tweed jacket and look more like a scientist. I've never seen that from scientists themselves. But what you do see it from is the media, right? And when you, as I have frequently done, you changed a film script so that the dialogue reflects the way actual scientists would talk, which is the way anybody would talk, not in this formal way that they, are pictured of talking, and that they don't always wear a white lab coat and that kind of stuff. If you make that change, the people in charge of the script will immediately revert it back to the stereotype. And that's because it, I presume it saves them a lot of trouble. They don't need a big backstory on who this person is. They're wearing a lab coat. We know who they are. And I wouldn't blame the scientists for this.
So, you're all raising good points. I think at the core, Elliot, your comment about storytelling, I certainly agree with. I think we're all, to a certain extent, invested in storytelling, all of us here on this panel. But what about this hackneyed phrase that if we just could dumb it down for the general public, that they would get it? Beth, you brought up the information deficit model. Why are we so reticent to take that next step, Seth? Are we don't have the cognitive capacity to think complex thoughts, to think about scientists as humans, that we don't have the capacity as scientists, as communicators, to then speak about to take on board in a more smart and intelligent way the different ways that we know and learn about various issues? Where are we coming up short here?
Well, Max, your question is, why are we afraid to dumb it down, or why do we dumb it down?
Why does that notion of dumbing it down for the general public persist? Why can't we just smarten it up through storytelling like Elliot's suggesting?
Well, you can smarten it up. I mean, that's just a question of how good you are at explaining the science, right? And scientists are no better and no worse than anybody else. I mean, you know, I could go to my local, I don't know, tire repair guy, and he might be great at telling stories, right? Or maybe not. And it's the same with scientists. Some scientists are good at it. And, you know, I mean, somebody like Carl Sagan is great at telling stories. Okay, let him tell the stories. I mean, I don't think that this is something that can be fixed by discussing it too much, because there always will be some people who are better at telling stories than others, and some of those are scientists. So let them tell some stories.
I agree with your point, though, Max. That I think that as scientists, a lot of times we think about dumbing it down, and that's a good concept to back away from, and thinking, okay, let me simplify my terms, let me make this accessible. And by accessible, I mean, you know, simpler terms, leaving out the jargon, and also, you know, stories, like how do we draw people in? And I think a lot of scientists also, of course, you know, generalizing scientists, but people who I've worked with, we also, I think, underestimate the public. We underestimate people's capacity to understand and to make decisions, and also to be engaged. I've talked to people who are like, oh, I didn't realize that people would be interested in my science. Of course they are. You do cool stuff. You work on earthquakes and volcanoes and how the earth works. And so I think we do, I think we can often underestimate our public or non-scientists or people outside our field.
Taking that a step further, I actually think that, like, I don't know, the specter of dumbing things down extends far beyond the purview of scientists. So, you know, if you look at people in many, many fields far beyond the scientific establishment, and then you read the most popular op-eds that are published from those fields, often those op-eds that are intended for a general audience are reductive, right? And I think that that's partly a nature of the medium. If you are trying to share something that is super quotable in a really, really short amount of time or a really, really short amount of space, that's when people tend to dumb it down. And so that puts the onus on us, right? On anyone trying to communicate any kind of truth, whether it's scientific or whether you're in another field, is to try to use the stories you're telling to not to reduce the complexity of what you're trying to convey, but actually illuminate it, right? Illuminate it for a set of people that don't necessarily share your specific life experience. And a great way to do that is, I mean, I find this to be sort of funny, but if you think of, like, listen to the scientists almost like an imperative, right? Like, listen to the scientists, and you think that people aren't, then you have to ask, well, how do you get people to listen to anything, right? Like, why do people listen to things, whether it's science or anything else? And people tend to listen to things that are interesting, right? So that means you have to offer them something interesting. And honestly, at least for me, one of the easiest ways to be interesting is to be interested, right? To be curious, to be fascinated about the world. And at least in my personal circle of friends who are scientists, that curiosity is often the seed that grew into their career, right? But when you're used to going to a conference where you are talking to the 6 other people who you're competing with for tenure, you know, that gets lost, right? Because now you're really talking about something that's hyper specific and that is perfect for the audience of 6, but not perfect for everyone else. And so I think that, you know, it's important to share enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is contagious, and that's something that you can leverage if you want people to listen to you. And so show that you're interested. That'll make you interesting, and do it in a way that, you know, someone who is intelligent, right? Like, that you're assuming your audience is intelligent, but it is and knows a lot of stuff. They just happen to know different stuff than you. And that's why you have to be really careful with things like jargon.
Other comments?
I think one other thing I just might add is that sometimes there's the challenge of scientists wanting to tell you everything about what you need to know about a topic. And a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times folks, they want to know what to do. And they want maybe not just one thing, but you could say, hey, here's the kind of 2 best ideas we have. Here's one idea that seems to be a bad idea. And that's where their interest lies. And the scientists are going to descriptive data and predictive things and control variables, all these other things might be interesting, but not really. When really what someone wants to hear from, if they're in a position of expertise, is, hey, what's the best thing to do right now?
That actually reminds me, I recently read the transcript of a wonderful speech. In fact, if you're listening, you should Google this. It's called You and Your Research. And it's a lecture given by, I think, Richard Hamming, the famous mid-century physicist, mathematician who's involved in the Manhattan Project and other things. And it's the talk itself is basically career advice for scientists. And what's really fascinating for this conversation is one of the things he touches on in the lecture is how underrated it is for scientists to address topics of general interest. So what you just said, right? Like, what do I do? What do I do in this situation is something that is rarely on a scientific conference panel, right? Like you're not going to see that topic, but that's actually how you invite other people to enter your world, right? We were talking before about mythology. Mythology, every mythological story basically addresses a universal human theme, no matter what, right? It's addressing a topic that every single person has to deal with in their own life experience. So to the extent that you can lead a conversation by addressing a universal theme and then inviting in research that can inform that theme, that can be a really great way of approaching the situation.
Start to incorporate a few of the questions that are coming in from the audience. I see a lot of great ones that are coming in already. And it's a way maybe for me to build on a few themes that you've been all raising as well. One thing I was struck by that Seth had said that I think is resonant in each of your comments is that you have to make it relevant, right? And a number of the questions that I'm seeing coming in are how science is relevant right now through the coronavirus, through COVID-19. And, maybe even a few weeks ago, we didn't know what an epidemiologist was. And now we know the name of an epidemiologist, right? And what he or she does. And so some of the questions here that are coming in is resonant around making it relevant through the current pandemic that we're in. And then another layer of this that I welcome your comments on is about trust again and how one trusts. There's questions here about one day a scientist says, don't wear a mask if you're walking well. The next day they say, do wear it. How do we as everyday people, if we took off our scientist hat, or Elliot, yours is off already. If we as everyday people navigate these complex spaces? Comments there?
I think one of the things that I'll do as a consumer of science, because I don't understand, I'm not an expert in the vast majority of science. And so this crisis has been kind of interesting. So maybe I could just share a little bit, at least how this guy has looked at some of that science. Scientists are humans is an important thing that you always want to keep in mind. And so they're under self-interest. They're constrained by certain environmental or contextual factors. So there's been things with the CDC, for example, or with the WHO, where we look back and we say, that seems like that wasn't actually accurate, or that wasn't the best advice. And I think there's imperfections with almost any perspective, and it's going to depend on which way the scientists approached it. The best way to get to a reliable answer is to triangulate. And so you'll hear scientists talk about triangulating around findings to find a robust answer. So with this, I'll look at Johns Hopkins has a great resource to see some of the latest findings and updates. You look at the CDC. I love Dr. Fauci, of course, like a lot of people. Probably get some Fauci socks or a mug or something like that. And then you might look at the WHO and triangulate it for yourself. Use your good reason and logic to say, well, what seems to be reliable and consistent here. When we have the luxury of years to kind of come across triangulating findings, that's a little bit easier. But I think one of the unfortunate things that's happened with the media sometimes is a singular study comes out and it gets publicized in a way that's really sensational, as if, hey, drinking red wine is gonna save your life, and then 2 months later, hey, red wine's gonna kill you, don't drink it. Of course, the public would get frustrated with that. But if you look at the aggregation of findings over time, that's how you usually find the best answer.
I think the virus has certainly shown that the public does appreciate the scientists, right? I mean, I don't know that, I mean, they're putting Fauci on donuts, right? So that's a sign of respect if there ever was one. I mean, have your face in some toxic toroid that you can buy online. That's terrific. But I think that the trick here is that science, of course, is, somebody said in terms of this virus, we're learning to fly when the plane is already in the air. So we're learning as we're going. And I think it only requires that you explain a little bit about how science is done, just as, Ty just said. It's always a work in progress, and people can understand that. I really do believe they can. They can say, yes, at first we thought maybe the masks were not a good idea, and this is why. And now we've, reconsidered. Science is not the Encyclopedia Britannica, stuff that was decided a long time ago. In particular, in this case, science is always changing. It's always evolving, but we're getting to answers in a rigorous way. And if you can explain the methods of science, I think people can understand that. They really can.
I guess one other thing on the current situation, this has been an observation, is that it's been rare, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think it's been rare for the scientists to get on television and to start out with saying, hey, I know you're probably scared. I know you're probably uncertain about a lot of things. And I too am concerned about my family and the people I love, and I'm uncertain about certain things. And starting with that kind of point of empathy before going into the facts and the expertise that everybody wants to hear from them. I think sometimes those small changes, and it could be through story or anecdote or just personal relatability, that can go a long ways, especially with something like this COVID crisis. It's kind of the elephant in the room. And I guess someone asked our president about a week ago, what would you tell Americans who feel scared right now? And that didn't go very well. But to me, as a social scientist, I think, gosh, that's actually, for scientists or for politicians or anybody else, right, in the public eye, that's actually one of the crucial questions to answer and to have a good answer for the general public.
So I think a lot about trust in terms of science communication, because I specialize in hazard communication, geoscience, earthquakes, volcanoes, but it also applies to things like COVID-19. And right to that point, we need to be trusted sources of information. And studies have shown that we assess trust as consumers of information. We assess trust differently in non-crisis times versus crisis times. In crisis times, we apparently assess trust based primarily on that emotional aspect. So trust has been described as a combination of competency, and scientists are super competent, right? Like, we know our stuff. So we know our stuff, and then how warm are we, and what are our intentions? Do we have good intentions? Are we thinking about people other than ourselves? And when we're assessing trust in times of crisis, we assess it within 9 to 90 seconds, we are weighing like 50% of our perception is based on that warmth factor. So for a scientist to come and say, I know this is scary, I'm scared too, my family lives in this area as well, we're experiencing this as well, that's what can really, and to do it authentically, of course, that's what can really build trust in times of crisis. So from the communication perspective, like, yes, we need to be human and admit that emotion is definitely a part of whatever's going on. And then just, to second what Ty said about the, how do we tell what sources to go to when there's conflicting information? I think as consumers, we need to look at multiple sources. In general, look at who's behind those sources, what interests they may have, what information is coming up in multiple sources. Is it a post I saw on Facebook? Is it a friend of a friend of a friend? Or is it an official website, the World Health Organization, CDC? And like you said, understanding that these sources are also fallible, and what Seth said, that science evolves. And I think that's partly what we need to work on as the communicators as well, is to indicate, our understanding has changed as new data has become available. So as consumers, we need to remember that science evolves, and hopefully we're always making decisions based on the best and most current information. And as communicators, we can work to do a better job of sharing that as well, to remind people that's why information changes, because we get new information. Which is one of the great things about science. I'll just put a plug in for that. One of the great things about science is it's not even changing our minds. It's every time we get new information, we incorporate that in. And that's, we try to be as unbiased as possible. And that's one of the great things about science, is that our understanding does evolve, and we allow it to evolve because we take in whatever the new information is.
So taking that and turning it into something really simple that I've found really helps me in my life as a consumer of science, and that people listening today or watching today might find useful too, is that when I'm looking into a topic, when I'm researching a topic for a new novel, for example, I read really deeply across a field. And often what I find is that rather than finding individual publications trustworthy, and these are particularly for like general interest publications. So if you think about like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, the New Scientist, right? I've found that that because trust takes time to earn, right? That I often trust individual people much more than I trust the brand that they might be working under. So one good example would be the briefings editor at The Economist. His name is Oliver Morton. He's written a number of just fantastically rigorous books on science, and he does a lot of the science features for that magazine, but also writes elsewhere. I would rather find his work in many different publications and find out what he's saying about the coronavirus situation, because I know he's done such a tremendous job of looking at many different scientific problems from many different perspectives. So I would rather find his work wherever it's being published than just read The Economist, right? So he's one person where, because over time he, through hard work, has earned that trust from me, I offer that trust to him, right? So, there are others, right? So I would think about, if you are reading widely about coronavirus and you're not sure what's going on, try to think about, okay, well, who have I actually been following for years that speaks to science in a way that has proven trustworthy, and what are they saying, right? So rather than watching whoever happens to be on the 6 o'clock news, actually seek out the individual writers or speakers or whoever that have already earned your trust, or that maybe, I don't know, maybe everyone else on this panel has some recommendations of names they can throw out there too, because I'd love that. But I think that's often what I find helpful, especially in times of crisis, because it's hard to know who to pay attention to.
So Elliot,
Go Go ahead.
Could I have a follow-up question for Elliot with
Oh,
that?
please, yeah.
So I have some thoughts on this, but I'm curious what you think. What if trust is misplaced? What about people who are trusting that conspiracy theorists and have full trust in them because they think they're providing the right information, the stuff that the government and other sources aren't providing?
Oh yeah, I mean, people have been lying for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? I mean, I feel like maybe one of the good fictional explorations of that question that's recent was the Chernobyl miniseries on HBO. I don't know if maybe some listeners have watched that. It's actually really fantastic, and they did an extraordinary amount of research, probably employing many consultants like Seth to help them make the show scientifically accurate to the extent that they wanted to fit that into the drama. But the underlying theme was not actually about, I don't know, building a reactor wrong. The underlying theme was that the minute that once you start telling lies, those lies build up, right? Just like pressure builds up along the edge of a tectonic plate, and eventually it breaks. It breaks when reality gets in the way. And I honestly think that's a lot of what's happening right now with coronavirus. We suddenly have realized that our lives pre-coronavirus were very, very comfortable in a way that they no longer seem to be, right? Since coronavirus took over the news cycle, and since we've all been, afraid for ourselves and our families, I haven't heard that much about anti-vaxxers. And so I think that there's a really interesting, that this is one of those moments, and that this is one of those moments when hopefully, we can find new voices that bring science into our lives.
There's a few questions that are coming in that maybe pivot on your comments, Elliot, about trusting of individuals and trusting of institutions. And if I can pivot on that, there's a couple questions that have come in through YouTube about how to distinguish between trusted, say, scientists or scientific organizations, we could say like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then those special interests paid to spread disinformation. Think of a prominent examples around climate change and carbon-based industry interests and trust that can be violated through that deliberate disinformation machine. Do folks have comments about elements of trust and it really just boiling it down to a political economy of protecting profits, protecting what one has?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always ask myself, what's in it for this person? And there's always something in it for somebody, right? But some of those are less dangerous than others. So this person is pushing some miracle cure for coronavirus or some miracle vaccination for it based on something that you just know as a smart person is likely untrue. You're like, well, they have a financial interest in this, obviously. If I go to John Hopkins website and it's the aggregation of some of the best doctors in the world, right, from one of the top 3 medical schools in the world, that's pretty trustworthy. And one of the reasons it's trustworthy is if someone went on there and said something that wasn't true, there would be social costs to pay for that. They would get it from all sides. The American Medical Association, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, they have a nice website that's publicly available. There's another place where it's like, well, what's the incentive for them to publish these findings and to publish this information and to aggregate these opinions from some of the best epidemiologists and MDs in the world once again? Well, it's probably I would think it's probably a virtuous aim. So I think if you ask yourself what's in it for the person, and second, you ask yourself, what's the credibility of the institution or of the organization? That can be a good way to proceed. Now, if it's not an area of expertise for you, let's say with the COVID, then you might ask a friend who's a nurse or ask a friend who's a medical doctor and say, hey, where would I turn to information that you think in your professional opinion would be reliable?
many years ago, Carl Sagan published a little article about a baloney detector, which I think would be useful now, actually, because I'm getting tired of the peanut butter and jelly that I just had for lunch. So I'm all for finding baloney. But in any case, well, I think item number one in terms of, spying baloney was, in fact, the affiliation of the person who was making the statement. And while people will sometimes say, oh, those elite scientists, they won't look at this, or, they're all in cahoots with one another and so forth. I think that that's a minority point of view. I really think when push comes to shove, as it does in a pandemic, of course, that if you're affiliated with, some respectable organization, the CDC or Cornell University or something like that, as opposed to being somebody, behind their keyboard in their basement, I think that Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch are pretty savvy about recognizing to whom they ought to listen.
So I think also it can be sometimes complicated. So years ago, Amazon recommended a book to me based on other books I had looked at, and it was called something like What Scientists Don't Want You to Know About Climate Change. Max, in all your years of studying this, maybe you're familiar. And I thought, I'm going to look into that a little bit more, because that sounds, that to me just raised a red flag. What scientists don't want you to know. Okay. So my coworkers and I took a little detour from our work to look into this. And it was a book that was published that I subsequently saw in major box stores. So it's an actual published book. It was in a prominent place in a store that people, go to and probably trust. And we had to, we really dug until we could figure out more information on the author or authors and also the publisher. And we found that it was written by somebody trained as a lawyer. So to me, that raised a red flag with credibility. Okay, well, you're going to tell me about science and scientists, but you're not a scientist yourself. And then when like I said, we had to dig some online to figure out who had funded this. It was published by a think tank that was funded by, among others, the American petroleum industry and a lot of other players that have stakes in the petroleum industry. So sometimes things really look official and inviting, and especially when they confirm our beliefs, we're going to be less likely to question. So one of the things I think we have to do is question, like, okay, well, who's funding this? Who gains from this? And does it, is it something that I want to know anyway? Does it really align with my perspective? Because I've found myself in that, like buying into conspiracy theories right away, like, oh, I know that person was bad. And, it makes a good story. It makes a good story that all the scientists are wrong about climate change. Well, it's not true. It's not the case. So I think we have to ask ourselves, does this sound like a really good story? Does this sound like a quick fix? Is this a silver bullet? And be able to step back and say, okay, let me think critically about this for a minute, especially before I pass that information on to somebody else through word of mouth or through my social media network.
Thank you. There's some.
Oh, go ahead. Did we lose Max?
Well, he got hit with a cosmic ray and
Go ahead, Seth.
Oh,
Am I back? I'm back.
You're back.
Okay. Sorry about that. So there are a lot, continue to send in your questions. I'm kind of blending them in the interest of time, but I do want to point out a few in particular. Wayne Seltzer has written in about, is it time to stop using the words believe and belief when discussing science and instead talking about it as evidence, and the evidence shows. And then also John Craig Holland has written in with, some of you may be familiar, or all of you may be familiar with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, where they both describe how humans use our limbic system, our emotional intelligence, much more. It's to questions about the front porch, people on the front porch seeing through nonsense or authenticity. Can you talk a little bit about the interactions of rationality with emotions and how that might help explain why or why not people are listening to scientists?
I would love to comment on that last one. I know I just spoke but I'll comment on just that last part of the question. I love those books. I'm a huge fan of The Righteous Mind, and I recommend it to everyone, partly because I think that for me, it helped build some empathy, because it allows me to see not everybody thinks like me, which we really need to internalize if we're going to reach an audience. We need to understand that not everybody thinks like us. And when I think about trying to change somebody's mind on something, he has a great image. Jonathan Haidt has a great image in his book about the rider and the elephant. The rider being the thinking part of us, and the elephant being the emotional part. So as a rider, we have some control over where the elephant goes, but not total control. So coming back to that identity piece that I was talking about at the beginning, I think of not only my elephant, but a herd of elephants as my identity. So when we're thinking about asking somebody to change their mind on something, think of a person riding an elephant in a whole herd of elephants, and all my fellow elephants, my friends, my family members, all the people I trust, the people I follow on social media, they're my fellow elephants. And if we're all moving in one direction, and I'm asking me to change my mind on climate change or on evolution or something, that a belief that I share or a notion or opinion I share with all these elephants, that's a really big ask for people. So for me, it's really helpful to keep that image in mind. It's not impossible. It's not impossible, but I think that for me is a really powerful image from his book, that so much rides, so to speak, on our emotional selves and our herd, our people.
I think it's well established that if you want to convince somebody of something where science has a different opinion to the popular view, what you do is don't give them, as you said at the beginning of this whole session, Beth, don't give them a slew of facts and say, listen to the facts. What you do is you try and convince their peers, because they will listen to their peers, because their peers share their belief system. So I think that's right. I did want to say something about, should we, the person who asked, should we stop scientists from saying, I believe this, I believe that? I mean, strictly speaking, that's correct. I have to say, I have a co-author on a textbook who lives in Boulder, and he's always saying the same thing. Don't use the word believe. Now, I understand that there is some sort of civic requirement in the city of Boulder that if you want to live within the bounds of Boulder, you have to forswear the use of the word believe if you're a scientist. I understand that, but I think getting rid of this is, that's a forlorn hope. I had a boss years ago, a NASA guy, when we were, starting up the SETI looking for aliens. He said, don't ever use the word alien because it has other meanings. Always use extraterrestrial. Well, this is a guy who never had to write any articles about looking for life beyond Earth, where you get really tired of extraterrestrial. It has too many syllables. You need a synonym, and that synonym is alien. So, forget the word, please.
Other comments?
I think one of the things with the current crisis is that people are freaked out, right? And one of the things they find in social psychology studies is that these kinds of cognitive errors we're talking about, confirmation bias and conveniently overlooking certain facts, it's those cognitive errors are much more pronounced under negative emotional states. So negative emotion has this effect of narrowing your focus, it puts you in a fight or flight kind of action tendency. And what that means is that you're more likely to be narrowly focused on what you already believe. And the easiest thing to do in that case is to eject from the negative emotion. So if you're hearing a story that the economy is tanking and the virus is spreading, and boy, it's just easier to kind of hit eject from those thoughts. And you could have some empathy with why somebody would be prone to do that. So I think this crisis has made it even more pronounced in some ways, just because the level of concern and despair I think that a lot of people have about this is not going to facilitate a lot of that deep reason-based thinking.
And just to maybe tie that together, a lot of the time when someone brings up reason versus emotion, it's a loaded question to begin with, right? So the implicit assumption is that reason is better, and we should be, that's what we should be aiming towards. So in this sense, if I'm the elephant rider, that my ultimate goal is to kill the elephant and move on, right? I mean, right? And I think that it's really important to remember that even when you read Kahneman's work, when you read about the metaphor of the elephant and the elephant rider, that a good elephant rider really understands elephants, right? Like that they have a symbiotic relationship, that's in fact what makes them more powerful than either of them could be apart, right? And so I think that, when you're thinking about your own thinking, when you're thinking about reason versus emotion and the role they play in your life and the role they play in how you interpret reality, remember that they're both, they're the two sides of the same coin. And that means that for you, like Ty said, this is a scary time. We're all dealing with these uncertainties that we're not used to. We're dealing with really dangerous situations. We're dealing with friends and often horrific situations, or that are working on the front lines in hospitals or what have you. We're worried that our business is now going out of business, that we've lost our jobs, and all of that. There's a lot to process there. There's a lot to process there, and we have to process it both rationally and emotionally. And so be aware of that in yourself. Like, let yourself feel, right? Like, let yourself work through that, and then also take that a step further and recognize that when you're dealing with others at times like these, that they are also processed. So they're trying to wash and feed their own elephant, right? And that they're not always riding it, right? Like sometimes they might be helping to heal it or whatever. So if you bear that in mind, just be patient with yourself and with others, especially in times like these.
I have another kind of blended set of questions from those that are coming in, and thank you to those who are submitting questions. With this basic call of listen to the scientists, from that is something that scientists then offer. Many of you have talked about, you have something to say. From that has come this notion of advocacy. And this is often treated as a denigrating notion, advocacy for a particular outcome, advocacy for a particular, veiled set of motives. But there's also advocacy for evidence, and there's advocacy for facts and truths. So how do you all respond to the notion of, by extension, by listening to the scientists, you enter into spaces of advocacy? Say, just as a very concrete example, Seth, in your weekly science radio show, Big Picture Science, you're advocating for evidence on a weekly basis, right?
Well, I hope so. But advocacy, as you say, has a negative connotation. So try not to do that. We're not, maybe I'm paraphrasing the president here when I say, we're not salesmen. I hope we're not salesmen. Look, I think the thing about science is that to begin with, it's mostly good news. In the case of a pandemic, it's not always good news, but in general, science is about discovery, understanding, and so forth. It's mostly good news. It's always fresh. There's always new science. Every day there's new science. So it's a wonderful story. I mean, there's so many wonderful stories in science, right? That I don't know that you need to be an advocate. I think you can be on the back of that particular elephant, which is the fact that, hey, here's something that's really interesting. And sure, you may not understand, the intricacy of the way the experiment was done or how the theory was worked out. But here's what it means to you, the car buyer. I don't know that you need to be an advocate. You just need to be a good, conveyor of the information, maybe.
Other thoughts?
Well, I was thinking about what Beth said earlier, about some of the values and some of the culture that surrounds science. And yeah, I think, one of the central things that any scientist is taught in just about any discipline is to be objective and to kind of have this ethic of disinterest, right, in the outcome, so that you can give everything a fair shot. So I think it's a tough thing actually for a lot of scientists to think about advocacy, because all of a sudden now you're taking a clear side, and not only in your own mind, but also advocating that to other people broadly. I don't know that that's something that comes naturally to a lot of scientists. And sometimes I guess I've seen, like Beth was saying earlier, that the culture, the science of culture, the culture around science can sometimes punish that. So if someone gets too opinionated, that doesn't always go over very well.
I think, yeah, I don't have a definitive answer to that question. I think it's not straightforward, and it's something that is talked about within scientific communities. So for example, with climate change, I know climate scientists who, as it turns out, are also human and have families, and then are concerned for their kids. And so the idea to them that they're not allowed to participate in advocacy as scientists is seems really backwards to them, because they are some of the people who have the best information, who are the most informed on the science and the forecasts and what they think is likely coming. And as human beings, it's really hard to not want to advocate. And like I said, this is an ongoing conversation. There's no definitive answer. I don't have one. I'm going to claim science on that as more information and opinions come out, I feel like I have a more informed understanding of what scientists can and should be doing. But we ran a whole session on this at the meeting of the American Geophysical Union last year, which is the largest meeting of climate scientists and other scientists, but climate scientists in the world. And there was, a whole session about, how do you walk that line? How can we as scientists advocate? And as Ty pointed out, like, are we allowed by our fellow scientists to do that? And what do we potentially sacrifice or risk in terms of the public trust? I think it's not straightforward.
I think another thing we've seen with this crisis is that if we don't advocate when there is some factual information available, someone else will for a different opinion. So I think, yeah, it is very complicated about how you navigate that.
I mean, there's something interesting here too, where really the only advocacy that we call advocacy is poorly executed advocacy, right? Like Seth, you said you don't want to sound like a salesman, right? On like that you're selling an evidence-based approach on your podcast and or on your radio show. And I think that that's sort of a funny truism is in business as well. Like often the people who are the best salespeople don't have sales in their title, and you wouldn't even realize that they're salespeople, right? So I think that one way to look at it is also, and like this might be worth considering if you're studying climate change and you don't know how to make your, how to help spread what you're discovering, is to think about all of your work as helping to share that truth, right? The truth that you are working really, really hard to uncover, and that just because that you believe something that you want to share, you don't have to do it like a used car salesman would. And in fact, were you to try to advocate in a really explicitly advocacy way, you'd probably be undermining your own efforts, right, to begin with. The minute you believe you're trying to sell someone on something, you're not doing a great job of it.
Oh, thank you. And I am sensitive to the time. And so with the many questions that have come in, I think that we've gotten to a number of them. I hope that folks that are listening in feel as though we're getting into some of those issues. We certainly can't get to everything. But at this point, I'd like to pivot into just inviting each of you for your final set of comments, maybe some of the things that you've considered through this conversation, some of the things that you feel like maybe haven't come up. I think we found consensus in terms of the title being Listen to the Scientists. I think we all agree we should, but who to trust. And so maybe take some of that time in recommending some folks, like you had mentioned, for instance, Elliot, Oliver Morton is somebody to trust. So whoever would like to speak first, just welcome your final comments.
I'll dig in. We've it's been what, an hour and a half max, something like that. We spent a lot of time talking about scientists, and we spent a lot of time talking about how to talk, like how to communicate effectively. And it strikes me that we actually haven't spent that much time talking about listening, right? And maybe that's sort of the note that I'd end on, that especially when we're in a really scary, uncomfortable situation, when we're facing a global pandemic, I get scared. Whenever I'm scared, I roll up just like a little roly-poly bug, right? Like it's really, really easy to just fall back on either the things I already believe, or to just follow whatever the top headline of the day is, right? That's supernatural. And I think that a lot of people are in that situation now. And at the same time, any kind of novel situation, in any kind of novelist situation, we all have to learn. We also learn about a lot of things, about science, certainly in this one, and about what that means for our lives moving forward, and how it might impact them. And I think that we have to recognize that to learn, we have to listen. Otherwise, we're not really getting any new data to make those decisions on or to form our worldviews with. And that listening requires you to make space to listen in your own life, to actually try to seek out views that complicate the world rather than views that simplify it. And that's a lot of emotional labor. That's a hard thing to do, especially when you're trying to make sure you have the right number of groceries, or that your spouse, who's a nurse, has the right mask, right? That's really tough to do, but it's in precisely these kinds of times that actually cultivating that space to listen is most important. So I think that if there's one thing to leave folks with, that's what I would, and it's something that I am trying to actively do in my own life and only occasionally succeeding.
Well, I'll follow up on that, since I don't know if you can see that, but those are my notes at the bottom. Oh, listening. Let's talk about listening.
Okay, great.
And listening is, I think it's the most important communication skill. Going back to the idea of communication, it's also one of the areas where we can really grow the most as humans in general. And we need to be able to listen to the scientists, and as scientists, we need to really be able to listen to the people around us, and ask questions. And not only is it a way to really learn about people's needs so we can understand those elephants, it's also a way, excuse me, it's also a way to gain trust. So tying in that trust theme, we trust people who can listen, and so that can help build trust between people. That's, it's critical. And I took a sneak peek at the questions early on, and I saw a question about, I have a friend who's a conspiracy theorist. How do I approach this friend? Asking questions and listening is a really great approach. And we won't always change people's mind, but we can understand them better, understand where people come from better. And if we're listening, we're going to increase the likelihood that somebody will also be able to listen to us. And then to go back to the idea of these are crazy times, listening to ourselves as well, being able to slow down and listen to ourselves is really critical, whether we're scientists or not. And we can listen as scientists and think, what's going on right now? What do I need? And what can I do about that?
Thank you, Beth.
Okay.
Beth?
Yeah, I don't want to take away from Ty's time, and we're almost at the bottom here. But yeah, I think that the people do listen to scientists, or will listen to scientists, because we like to listen to somebody who is expert about a subject. If I hear a knocking down in the tappets of my car's engine, right, I take it to somebody who repairs cars. He has expertise, right? And I think that people look at scientists the same way. When I was a kid, people would come on the television and say 9 out of 10 doctors recommend this brand. And of course, I smoked that brand, because after all, if 9 out of 10 doctors recommended it, that's expertise. So, we have that going. Actually, I don't smoke, but we have that going for us. And the real problem is that there are some people who are suspicious of that expertise. It's not many, but the only way to fix that, those are attitudinal problems. The only way to fix that is to get them to understand science when they're young. And that just gets back to the fundamental problem for society always, which is education.
Thank you, Seth. And to you, Ty.
I just briefly, I guess I'd say like most of us kind of know what to do, right? We know from what science has been telling us what the best things are to socially isolate. We should wash our hands, all these good things. And so those are the things we can control. And I guess I'd just say that once those facts stop and the science ends, then there's being human after that. And that, and one of my favorite psychologists was Erich Fromm, this guy from the kind of 1900s. And he said the best you can do in times like this is to love the people who you're close to and be a good person and have the greater good in mind. So I think that's a good thing for us to remember as well.
Thank you, Ty. So thank you to all of our panelists. I've definitely learned a lot by listening to you all, and I hope that everyone else listening in has done as well. As this session closes, all audience members are going to be invited to complete a short survey. So please go ahead and complete that. Also, preparations are already underway for Conference on World Affairs next year. And aspirationally, we're going to all meet in person. If you'd like to make a gift to Conference on World Affairs to help make this possible, go to www.colorado.com/CWA. So in closing, thank you again to Beth, to Elliot, to Seth, and to Ty, which Seth has pointed out the acronym is BEST. Thank you to everyone for joining in on this virtual session today called Listen to the Scientists, and definitely appreciate your time and contributions.